The most heartbreaking sound at the Family Feud studio that Tuesday afternoon wasn't something anyone else could hear. It was the voicemail that 15-year-old Sophie Chen played obsessively through her earbuds. Her mother's voice saying, "Have a wonderful day at school, sweetheart. I love you more than all the stars in the sky," over and over again. Sophie clutched her phone like a lifeline as she walked through the bright Family Feud corridors beside her father, David Chen. Her thumb hovering constantly over the replay button of a message that had been recorded 14 days, 6 hours, and 23 minutes ago, the last words her mother had ever spoken to her. David Chen, a 45-year-old software engineer, maintained the careful composure of someone navigating fresh grief while trying to provide stability for his surviving child. His wife Linda had died suddenly from a brain aneurysm 2 weeks prior, leaving behind a void that seemed to grow larger rather than smaller with each passing day. The Family Feud application had been Linda's idea, submitted months earlier when she was still alive and excited about the possibility of appearing on television with her family. When the acceptance call came 3 days after Linda's funeral, Sophie had insisted they honor the commitment because, as she'd told her father through tears, "Mum would be so mad if we wasted this chance because she couldn't be here." Sophie's relationship with her phone had become obsessive since her mother's death. She checked it constantly, not for new messages, but to ensure that the precious voicemail was still there, that the digital recording hadn't somehow disappeared or become corrupted. The message was 47 seconds long, and Sophie had calculated that she'd listened to it at least 200 times since Linda's death, memorizing not just the words, but every inflection, every breath, every background sound that proved her mother had once been alive and thinking of her. In the Family Feud green room, Sophie's behavior revealed the depth of her anxiety about loss and permanence. She kept her phone plugged into a portable charger, terrified that the battery might die and somehow take the voicemail with it. When other families tried to engage her in conversation, Sophie would nod politely, but her attention remained focused on her phone, her finger constantly checking that the voicemail was still accessible, still intact. David watched his daughter with the helpless concern of a parent who understood that grief was a process, but worried that Sophie's attachment to the voicemail was preventing her from moving through that process in a healthy way. He'd consulted with a grief counselor who had gently suggested that Sophie's fear of losing her mother's voice reflected her terror of forgetting her mother entirely, as if the voicemail was the last tangible connection to a woman who had shaped her entire 15-year existence. Steve Harvey approached the Chen family during the pre-show introductions with his characteristic warmth, but something about Sophie's distracted behavior immediately caught his attention. In decades of hosting, Steve had developed an instinct for reading teenagers, and there was something about this 15-year-old's anxious relationship with her phone that suggested recent trauma or loss. "Well, hello there, beautiful," Steve said, kneeling down slightly to Sophie's level, with the gentle respect he reserved for young people who seemed to be carrying heavy emotional burdens. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophie Chen," she replied, her voice polite but distant, her attention still partially focused on her phone screen. She had the distracted quality of someone whose mind was elsewhere, processing something too large and painful for casual conversation. David stepped forward, his expression carrying the weight of recent loss. "Steve, we lost Sophie's mother 2 weeks ago. Very suddenly. Sophie's been having a hard time with it." Steve's expression shifted immediately from entertainment mode to something much more human and compassionate. He'd worked with enough grieving families to recognize the particular challenges of sudden loss, the way unexpected death leaves survivors struggling to accept a reality that feels impossible and wrong. "Sophie," Steve said gently, looking directly into her eyes, "I'm so sorry about your mum, honey. That's a big loss for someone your age to carry." Sophie nodded, her composure wavering slightly as she gripped her phone more tightly. "Thank you. She really wanted to be on the show. She said you were funny and kind, and she thought it would be a good memory for our family." The simple statement carried profound weight. Steve understood immediately that this appearance was both an honor to Sophie's mother's wishes and a painful reminder of all the experiences they would never share. Looking at Sophie, Steve saw a teenager who was trying to hold on to her mother through whatever means available, even if those means might be preventing her from healing. Steve noticed Sophie's constant attention to her phone, the way she checked it compulsively even during their brief conversation. "That's a pretty important phone you've got there," he observed gently. Something special on there. Sophie's response was immediate and defensive. My mom's last voicemail to me. She left it the morning before she died. I listened to it so I don't forget her voice. The honesty of the statement hit Steve harder than he'd expected. Here was a teenager who had found a way to keep her mother present through technology, but who was also clearly terrified of losing even that tenuous connection. The grief counselor's warnings about Sophie's attachment suddenly made perfect sense to Steve, who understood both the comfort and the prison that such attachments could create. As the Chen family took their positions for the actual game, the production crew made accommodations that touched Steve's heart. They allowed Sophie to keep her phone with her at the family podium, understanding that separating her from it would cause more anxiety than it would solve. Sophie stood between her father and her aunt, her mother's sister who had flown in from Seattle to provide support during this difficult time. The Chen family was competing against the Williams family from Texas, but from the opening moments, Steve found himself paying as much attention to Sophie's emotional state as to the actual game. She participated when required, but her responses were automatic, mechanical, as if she was going through the motions of living while her real attention remained focused on preserving her connection to her mother. During the first 2 rounds, Sophie surprised everyone with her thoughtful contributions, despite her obvious distraction. When Steve asked for things that make you feel close to someone, Sophie quickly answered, their voice, earning a spot on the board, but also revealing the central preoccupation of her grief. Her answer was technically correct for the game, but everyone present understood that she was speaking from raw personal experience. Steve noticed troubling details during the game. Sophie checked her phone between every question, her anxiety visibly increasing whenever she couldn't immediately access the voicemail. During commercial breaks, she would put in her earbuds and listen to the message, her face showing both comfort and pain as she heard her mother's voice again. During a commercial break before the final round, Steve watched Sophie's behavior with growing understanding. The teenager was clearly trapped in a cycle of seeking comfort from her mother's voice while simultaneously reinforcing her fear of losing that voice forever. Her grief had found a focus in the voicemail, but that focus was preventing her from processing the larger reality of her mother's death. "You doing okay, honey?" Steve asked Sophie directly during the break. Sophie nodded, but her response revealed the depth of her anxiety. "I just keep thinking about what happens when this phone breaks, or when the voicemail gets deleted somehow. It's the only way I can still hear her tell me she loves me." The simple honesty of the statement hit Steve with unexpected force. Here was a teenager articulating the terror that comes with realizing that memories fade, that the details of lost loved ones become harder to recall over time. That death is not just the end of presence, but the beginning of forgetting. The final round arrived with the Chen family holding a slight lead, but Sophie's anxiety had clearly increased as the game progressed. Steve announced the category with his usual enthusiasm, unaware that the topic would create one of the most profound moments in Family Feud history. "We asked 100 people," Steve declared. "What's your family's most important tradition?" It was Sophie's turn at the podium. She stepped forward with the careful movements of someone managing intense anxiety, her phone clutched tightly in her free hand. Her eyes met Steve's with an intensity that suggested this question carried profound personal meaning for her. Steve repeated the question, his voice unconsciously gentling as he sensed the weight this topic carried for Sophie. "What's your family's most important tradition?" For the first time during the entire taping, Sophie hesitated in a way that seemed different from normal contestant consideration. Her pause was longer, more emotionally loaded, and Steve realized that this question was asking Sophie to confront the reality that family traditions might not survive the death of the person who had created and maintained them. Sophie looked down at her phone, then at her father, then directly into Steve's eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying a vulnerability that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something profound. "My mum called me every morning before school," Sophie said, her voice beginning to break. "She left voicemails when I couldn't answer. I have her last one from the day she died, and I'm terrified if I delete it, I'll forget how much she loved me." The studio fell completely silent. Not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for the next laugh, but the heavy silence of hundreds of people collectively processing something too raw and heartbreaking for immediate response. Sophie's answer had transcended the game show format entirely, offering a glimpse into the specific terror of technological grief, the way modern loss includes the fear of losing digital connections to the people we've lost. Steve's professional composure cracked visibly. His entertainer's mask gave way to something much more human as he processed the devastating honesty of Sophie's response. Here was a teenager who had found a way to keep her mother's love present through technology, but who was also clearly imprisoned by her fear of losing even that connection. "Sophie," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't trying to hide, "can you tell me what your mom said in that voicemail?" Sophie's response came through tears, now, as if she'd been waiting for someone to ask, someone to acknowledge the preciousness of what she was protecting. She said, "Have a wonderful day at school, sweetheart. I love you more than all the stars in the sky," Sophie recited, the words clearly memorized from countless repetitions. It was just a regular Tuesday morning. She didn't know it would be her last message to me. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation and every rule of television production. "Stop the music," Steve called out, his voice carrying an authority that immediately silenced everyone in the studio. "Stop everything right now." The Family Feud theme music cut out abruptly. The cameras continued recording, but every crew member understood that they were no longer producing entertainment. Steve walked away from his podium towards Sophie, his movement deliberate and protective, like someone who had just recognized a profound moment of human connection that transcended television. The studio audience watched in complete silence as Steve approached this 15-year-old who had just shared something devastatingly honest about the nature of modern grief and the fear of forgetting our most precious memories. Steve knelt on the studio floor in his expensive suit, his attention completely focused on Sophie, who stood at the podium clutching her phone like it contained her mother's actual presence. "Sophie," Steve said gently, "I want you to help me understand something. You're afraid that if you delete that voicemail, you'll lose your mom's love?" Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's the last time she told me she loved me. If I can't hear her saying it anymore, what if I start to doubt that she really did?" Steve's heart broke as he realized the full scope of what Sophie was carrying. Not just grief for her lost mother, but the terror that love itself might be as fragile and deletable as a digital recording. That the proof of being loved could disappear with a single technological failure. "Can I tell you something about your mom's love?" Steve asked softly. "Something I know for sure, even though I never met her?" Sophie nodded, her attention completely focused on Steve despite her grief. "Your mum's love isn't in that phone," Steve said with gentle authority. "Your mum's love is in the way you worry about losing it, because only someone who was deeply loved would fight so hard to keep that love alive." He continued, his voice carrying conviction that seemed to reach something deep inside Sophie's grief. "That voicemail isn't what makes your mum's love real. Your mum's love is real because it changed who you are. It's in your kindness, your thoughtfulness, the way you honor her memory by being here today. The voicemail is beautiful, but it's just an echo. The real love is living inside you." Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of shows, had made millions of people laugh, had built a career on bringing joy to others through entertainment. But sitting on that studio floor with Sophie Chen, he found himself confronting the reality that some fears are bigger than loss itself. They're about the terror of forgetting, of love becoming just a memory rather than a living presence. "Sophie," Steve said, his voice breaking slightly, "I want you to try something with me. I want you to close your eyes and think about your mom, not the voicemail. Just her. What do you remember?" Sophie closed her eyes, and for the first time since her mother's death, she focused on the person rather than the recording. "I remember how she hummed while she cooked dinner," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. "I remember how she always knew when I was worried about something, even when I didn't say anything. I remember how safe I felt when she hugged me." "Those memories," Steve said with gentle authority, "those come from your heart, not your phone. Those can't be deleted because they're not stored in technology. They're stored in love. And love is the only thing that death can't touch." Steve began removing his suit jacket, the gesture that had become his signature in moments when entertainment gave way to ministry. As he wrapped the expensive garment around Sophie's thin shoulders, the symbolism felt particularly powerful, a tangible reminder that some comforts come from human connection rather than technological preservation. "This jacket," Steve said, loud enough for everyone in the studio to hear, "belongs to someone who understands that love is bigger than any recording, stronger than any fear, and more permanent than any technology." Sophie pulled the jacket tight around herself, and for the first time since her mother's death, she set her phone down on the podium without checking the voicemail. The gesture was small but profound, a moment of trust that her mother's love would survive even without constant technological confirmation. "Sophie," Steve continued, "I want you to understand something. When you're ready, not today, not tomorrow, but when you're ready, you can let go of that voicemail. Because your mum's voice isn't in your phone. Your mum's voice is in your heart, telling you every day that you're loved, that you're strong, that you're exactly who she raised you to be." Steve turned to address the entire studio audience, his voice carrying conviction that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something important. "This young lady taught us something today," Steve announced. "She taught us that love isn't something we can lose, even when we lose the people who love us. She taught us that grief is really just love, with nowhere to go, and that the bravest thing we can do is trust that love to live inside us instead of trying to trap it in our phones." "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve declared, "we're going to do something special today. We're going to show Sophie that her mother's love is everywhere, in this room, in the hearts of people who understand that some connections are stronger than death, more permanent than any voicemail, and more real than anything technology can preserve." The applause that followed was unlike any sound the Family Feud studio had ever heard. It wasn't typical game show celebration, but something deeper, something that acknowledged the profound courage it had taken for Sophie to share her truth, and the possibility that healing might mean letting go of the very thing that felt like her last connection to her mother. As the celebration continued around her, Sophie stood in the center of it all, wearing Steve's jacket, like armor against grief, her phone resting quietly on the podium beside her. For the first time since her mother's death, she wasn't listening for her mother's voice in a recording. She was feeling for her mother's presence in her own heart, discovering that love had been there all along, independent of any technology, any proof, any external validation. 3 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Sophie Chen made a decision that would have seemed impossible in the Family Feud studio. She opened her phone, scrolled to her mother's voicemail, and with a streaming down her face but resolution in her heart, she pressed delete. The message disappeared, but as Sophie closed her phone and looked around her room, at the pictures of her mother, at the books they'd read together, at all the ways her mother's love had shaped the space they'd shared, she realized that Steve had been right. Her mother's voice wasn't gone. It was everywhere. In Sophie's own voice when she comforted friends, in her laughter when something struck her as funny, in her kindness when she encountered people who were hurting. 6 months later, Sophie called Steve Harvey on the anniversary of her Family Feud appearance. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to share something important. "Steve," Sophie said, her voice stronger than it had been in the studio. "I deleted the voicemail. How do you feel about that, honey?" Steve asked, settling in for a conversation he'd been hoping for. "Free," Sophie replied, with surprising wisdom. "I realized I was so busy trying to preserve her voice that I wasn't listening to it. When I finally let go of the recording, I could hear her in everything. In my own voice, when I say I love you. In my memories when I think about all the ways she showed me love. In my heart when I miss her, but know she's still part of who I am." Steve smiled, remembering the grieving teenager who had taught an entire television studio about the difference between preserving love and living it, about the courage required to trust that some things are too strong to be lost, even when we let go of our attempts to control them. The jacket that Steve had given Sophie became a symbol of that trust, a reminder that some comforts come from human connection rather than technological preservation. As Sophie grew and changed, learning to carry her mother's love as a living presence, rather than a recorded memory, she eventually passed the jacket on to another teenager who was struggling with the fear of forgetting a lost parent. But the most important gift Sophie received that day wasn't the jacket. It was the recognition that love doesn't live in our phones. It lives in our hearts, in our actions, in the way we choose to honor the people who shaped us by becoming the best versions of ourselves. Because sometimes a 15-year-old can teach an entire television studio that the most precious voices aren't the ones we can replay, but the ones that live on in how we speak to the world with the love we were given. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten, because sometimes the most important messages aren't stored in our devices. They're stored in our hearts, where they can never be deleted, never be lost, and never stop telling us exactly how much we are loved.